Something troubling was spreading across the American frontier, and almost no one saw it coming. At the center of it all was a substance that promised relief, but carried hidden dangers: opium. This time, it wasn't about shootouts or outlaws, but a quiet addiction hidden in plain sight. According to those who lived through it, it started with a single dose and ended with lives falling apart. So how did opium take hold of the Wild West? And why has history kept it so quiet? Join us as we reveal the mysteries behind the opium outlaws. Origins of opium use in America. Before the Wild West became a place of legends, before the stories of gold, cowboys, and outlaws, something else was spreading quietly across the land. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with gunfights or gold dust, but it changed lives all the same. That something was opium. You see, the American frontier was full of hope and hard work. People came chasing dreams, miners digging for gold, settlers building homes, railroad workers laying track across the open land. But behind all that ambition, something darker was growing. Opium found its way into the lives of these people, and for many, it was difficult to escape its grip. It started out simple. For a long time, opium was seen as medicine, a miracle drug. By the 1800s, doctors in America were using it to treat just about everything: headaches, coughs, stomach problems, pain from injuries, and even what they called women's troubles. It came in different forms: pills, powders, and laudanum, a mix of opium and alcohol that was easy to drink and easy to get. During the Civil War, the drug spread even faster. Union doctors gave out millions of opium pills and bottles of tinctures to treat wounded soldiers. It helped ease their pain, but many developed a dependence without fully understanding it. When the war ended, some of those men went west, looking for a new start, but they didn't leave their addiction behind. They brought it with them, and it followed them into the new towns and mining camps of the frontier. But opium didn't just come through medicine, it also came with people. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, and people from all over the world rushed in, hoping to strike it rich. Among them were thousands of Chinese immigrants. They came looking for work and a better life, and with them came the practice of opium use for relaxation and escape. By the 1850s, San Francisco had become the center of this new kind of opium use. In Chinatown, small, smoky rooms known as opium dens became popular. People went there to rest, to forget their troubles, and to feel something different, something that could offer a brief relief from harsh realities. These dens later spread to other frontier towns, especially places with lots of miners and railroad workers, like Virginia City in Nevada or Deadwood in South Dakota. Now, if you love what you have heard so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification, because what's coming next is even better. Opium kept spreading, and money had a lot to do with it. Big American companies like Perkins and Company and Russell and Company made huge profits selling opium overseas, especially in China during the Opium Wars. Whatever they didn't sell abroad, they brought back home. Ships carried raw opium and bottles of laudanum to ports like San Francisco and New Orleans. From there, it made its way inland. It ended up in general stores, drugstores, and doctors' offices all across the frontier. Out there, opium was everywhere. It was medicine, comfort, and escape, all in one. People used it to treat pain, but also to deal with loneliness, loss, and the hard life they were living. In some towns, it was just as common as coffee or tobacco. No one asked too many questions. It was easy to get, and no laws stopped it. And slowly, it became part of life on the edge of America. Bottled relief: how medicine hit a crisis. By the mid-1800s, opium had become more than just a drug. It was a household name. You didn't have to walk into a shady saloon or a smoky den to find it. All you had to do was visit your local store or open your cabinet. It came in bottles, powders, pills, and syrups, tucked neatly into medicine chests across the American frontier. These weren't black market drugs. They were sold legally, often proudly, under names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, and Ayer's Cherry Pectoral. Sold in colorful bottles with fancy labels, they promised everything from the ability to calm babies to pain-free mornings. And they worked, at least for a while. Mothers gave it to teething babies to stop their crying. Farmers took it for back pain. Women drank it for menstrual cramps, sadness, or what doctors called female troubles. In fact, women made up one of the largest groups of opium users in America, not because they were chasing a high, but because they were simply following medical advice. Doctors were still learning how to treat pain, so they believed opium was safe. And without regulations or warning labels, no one questioned how often it was being used. It was a solution for everything, and a cure for nothing. The American frontier made everything harder: birth, illness, heartbreak, survival. And opium became a way to soften those edges. It dulled pain, calmed nerves, and helped people keep moving forward. It wasn't always abuse. Sometimes it was the only thing that helped someone sleep at night. But that ease came at a cost that will shock you. Once someone started taking opium regularly, stopping became a different story. And in a place like the frontier, where help was far away and doctors didn't always have answers, addiction went unnoticed, or worse, ignored. People didn't talk about it. They just took another dose. And it wasn't just everyday folks relying on opium. Even the people giving out the medicine, the doctors and pharmacists, were known to rely on it personally as well. Without modern knowledge of addiction, they often prescribed what they personally trusted. Many became addicted unknowingly, believing they were simply treating their own stress or physical pain. The frontier was supposed to be a land of new beginnings, but with opium so deeply woven into its medical culture, many found themselves carrying old habits westward. Bottled relief had become a quiet trap. And the line between patient and addict was growing harder to see. And here comes the twist. If you were to walk down a dusty street in a frontier town like Dodge City or Tombstone in the 1870s, you probably wouldn't spot an addict. You'd see miners, ranchers, soldiers, mothers, school teachers. But look closer, and the truth was hiding in plain sight. Addiction didn't wear a label. It didn't always look desperate. Sometimes it looked like a wounded veteran with a morphine bottle in his coat. Sometimes it looked like a preacher's wife sipping laudanum before supper. And sometimes it looked like the town doctor, measuring out just a little more than he should have. The Civil War had left deep wounds, both visible and invisible. Soldiers who had survived bullets and bayonets were given opium to numb their pain. Doctors carried it on the battlefield like a miracle cure. And for many men, it worked until they tried to stop. By the time the war ended, tens of thousands were dependent. When those veterans went west looking for a fresh start, they brought their injuries, their trauma, and their bottles with them. Women, too, were among the most affected. Life on the frontier was hard, isolating, and emotionally draining. They suffered frequent miscarriages, dealt with long winters of loneliness, and buried more children than they ever expected. Doctors often didn't have answers, but they did have opiates. A few drops of laudanum and the sadness would ease, at least for a while. There was no shame in using it, no stigma. In fact, regular opium use was often seen as civilized, especially when compared to alcohol. It didn't cause loud fights or public scenes. It just made everything quiet. Some women took it daily, some couldn't sleep without it. They weren't considered addicts, they were patients. And the medical world, still blind to the risk of dependency, continued to refill their prescriptions without hesitation. Even lawmen weren't immune. Out in the rougher towns where violence was a daily threat, sheriffs and marshals carried more than guns. A hit of opium or a swig of laudanum helped take the edge off injuries or stress. It helped them show up to work the next day until they couldn't stop. And then there were the doctors themselves. With no licensing requirements or oversight in many territories, a doctor might be someone who'd studied medicine or just read a book or two. Many treated their own ailments with the same drugs they gave others. That made denial even easier. After all, if the person handing out the medicine was taking it too, how bad could it really be? Addiction did not discriminate. It didn't care about race, gender, or job title. And in the wide, lonely spaces of the American frontier, where help was far away and the days were long, opium became a quiet companion for more people than history has remembered. But it wasn't always quiet forever. Some towns began to notice the toll. People losing jobs, families breaking down. People were also discovered lying unresponsive beside their medicine bottles. Stories started to spread that either a rancher couldn't work without his daily dose, a shopkeeper nodded off behind the counter, or even a widow that gradually declined in health year after year. Still, no one wanted to call it what it was. Substance reliance conflicted with the heroic image of the West. The West was about toughness, survival, control. So, admitting addiction meant admitting weakness, and that's not what frontier legends were made of. So instead, people looked the other way. They whispered, They excused it. They said, "She's just tired," or "He's got a bad back." And in doing so, they allowed the crisis to grow. It wasn't just a drug. It was woven into the culture, stitched into the fabric of frontier life. And before long, it would be impossible to ignore. But what exactly was inside those drugs? Curious to find out, stay tuned. High noon in Chinatown, medicine for some, blame for others. By the 1870s, the American frontier was fed up. People were starting to question what was really inside all those miracle cures doctors and salesmen had been pushing for years. Bottles were everywhere, in homes, general stores, and doctors' bags. But no one really knew what they were swallowing, so folks started digging. They took bottles like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup off the shelves and asked, "What's in this stuff?" What they found was shocking. A single bottle meant for teething babies had enough morphine to knock out a grown man. Mothers had been giving it to their infants, trusting the label, thinking it was safe. And it wasn't just that syrup. Other cures were filled with laudanum, a strong mix of alcohol and opium, paregoric, and even raw morphine. People were using these drugs every day for headaches, coughs, back pain, depression, or just to sleep, and had no idea they were taking addictive narcotics. But here's the strange part. Even after people realized what was in those bottles, no one really panicked. At least, not at first. Why was that so? The answer is simple. You see, by that time, these drugs were part of everyday life. Doctors gave them out. Women used them to manage pain and sadness. Veterans from the Civil War relied on them just to get through the day. And as long as you took your opium quietly, behind closed doors, no one said much. If it came in a bottle with a fancy label, it was medicine. If you were white and middle class, no one asked questions. But while opium used through tonics and tinctures was accepted, something else was causing real fear. Smoking opium, especially in Chinese communities. Back in 1848, when gold was discovered in California, people rushed in from all over the world. Thousands of Chinese immigrants came to work in the mines, build railroads, and start new lives. With them, they brought a tradition, smoking opium in small, quiet rooms called opium dens. These dens weren't loud or violent. People came to rest, relax, and forget their worries for a while. But to many white Americans, this practice looked strange and dangerous. Rumors spread fast. Newspapers told wild stories about Chinese men luring white women into their dens, where they would be influenced or taken advantage of. Preachers warned their congregations about moral decay and foreign corruption. Politicians used the growing fear to push for new laws. People didn't seem to care that white men were also going to these dens. Miners, gamblers, cowboys, even local police. That part didn't make the headlines. The public only saw one thing: Chinese men with opium pipes. And that was enough to spark outrage. In 1875, San Francisco passed the first anti-drug law in the United States. But it didn't ban opium altogether, just the act of smoking it in public dens, specifically targeting Chinese communities. White people were still allowed to take opium at home in their medicinal forms. It wasn't really about stopping addiction. It was about control. It was about race. Soon, other cities followed. Laws were passed that didn't touch morphine bottles or laudanum drops, but cracked down hard on opium dens and Chinese immigrants. Police raided dens. People were arrested. The same drug that filled American homes was now being treated like a threat, but only when it came with Chinese faces and Chinese customs. This double standard was everywhere. A white woman drinking laudanum to calm her nerves was seen as delicate. A Chinese man using opium to unwind after a long day's work was seen as dangerous. The truth was, addiction didn't care where you were from. It didn't care what form the drug came in, but public opinion did. And that opinion shaped the first wave of America's drug laws, not with science or concern for health, but with fear, racism, and a need to protect the image of good society. So, while white communities quietly dealt with growing addiction behind curtains and medicine cabinets, Chinese immigrants faced widespread scrutiny, stigma, and legal action for doing the same thing, just more openly. In the end, the opium crisis wasn't just a medical issue. It became a social weapon used to define social divisions and reinforce exclusion. The real problem wasn't just in Chinatown, it was everywhere. But blaming someone else was easier than looking in the mirror. Yet it did not end there. Stay with us because we are about to reveal why they took these drugs. The real reason people took the drugs. But behind every bottle, every pipe, and every whispered warning was something even deeper, a daily battle between pain, survival, and the desperate need to feel something different, or nothing at all. Life on the American frontier was hard. It was not the kind of difficulty that came and went, it was constant. People lived with back-breaking labor, brutal weather, sickness, childbirth without help, long months of isolation, and the looming threat of violence, disease, or loss. There were no safety nets, no hospitals nearby, no therapists, and very few second chances. So, in a world like that, pain wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. And for many, opium became the one thing that helped. Some used it to numb grief. Others sleep through another cold night. Some used it for physical wounds that never fully healed. Others took it because they couldn't stop crying and didn't know why. The term mental health didn't exist yet, neither did trauma, but both were everywhere, tucked into the lives of settlers, veterans, widows, minors, and mothers. People didn't think of themselves as addicts. They thought of themselves as tired, worn down, trying to make it one more day. When they took opium, they weren't chasing a high, they were chasing relief. A widow who had buried 2 children in the same winter might take a few drops of laudanum just to get through the morning. A rancher who lost a leg to a farming accident might drink paregoric before trying to saddle a horse. A teenage girl stuck in a town with no future might sneak a dose just to mentally escape her circumstances. And when something works, when it silences the ache, when it brings calm where there was once panic, it's hard to let go. Especially when no one is warning you it might destroy you later. That's why so many didn't stop. Not because they didn't want to, but because the underlying pain never truly went away. It's easy to call it a vice from a distance, to say they should have known better, but knowing better requires information, education, and options. And most people back then didn't have any of those. What they had was pain, silence, and bottles that were marketed as a source of comfort. For some, it was a choice. For others, it was the only choice. Opium wasn't just a drug. It was a lifeline, but a tough one that carried serious risks. It lets people survive what might have otherwise broken them. And in many cases, it broke them anyway. So how did they overcome it? Let's find out. How they overcame the opium disease. So, when you ask how they overcame the opium disease, the hard truth is, most of them didn't. Not on their own. What changed wasn't their pain. It was the world around them. By the late 1800s, America wanted to clean itself up. The frontier was closing, and the country was trying to look more modern, more respectable. Because of this change, addiction didn't fit the new image. And just like that, the same bottles that once sat quietly in medicine cabinets now drew suspicion. The people who used them were no longer seen as struggling. They were unfairly labeled or marginalized. The push to purify the land began with laws and loud voices. Reformers, especially from temperance groups and churches, launched campaigns to rid the nation of vice. They spoke out against opium in the same breath as alcohol and gambling. But what they didn't say out loud was that their anger often had a target. Chinese immigrants, poor women, and working-class addicts became symbols of everything that needed fixing. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act forced companies to start telling the truth. No more secret tonics or miracle cures. Labels had to list ingredients. Suddenly, people realized the soothing syrups they gave their children were full of morphine. The powders they took for sleep were laced with opium. Trust began to crack. Then, in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act brought it all under government control. Doctors had to register and justify every prescription. People dependent on opiates no longer had open access, and those who did, especially if they were poor or non-white, were often treated as criminals. But these laws didn't solve the problem. They just drove it underground. People still needed relief. They just couldn't talk about it anymore. And over time, the story of what had happened, who had used it, and why, began to disappear. The Wild West became a myth of rugged cowboys, fearless sheriffs, and wide-open freedom. There was no room in that story for someone quietly struggling, using laudanum to find rest. There was no space for women crushed by grief or men forever changed by war. Their suffering did not match the Western myth. So, History edited it out. Museums filled with six-shooters and gold pans, but said nothing about the bottles of paregoric that once lined general store shelves. Western films gave us outlaws with guns, but never showed the addicts in back rooms. The truth was buried, and in its place, we built legends. But the people were real. The pain was real. And the silence that followed it left a hole in our understanding of the American frontier. Addiction did not make these people weak. It made them human. And if we want to understand the West as it really was, not just the myth, we have to remember the parts that were forgotten on purpose. Because the crisis didn't end. It just changed its name. So, what are your thoughts on the forgotten addicts of the American frontier? Could you have made it through those harsh days without reaching for the bottle, or would you have done the same just to survive? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden chapters from history. And make sure to click the next video on your screen, because if this story pulled you in, the next one will take you even deeper.